Hi everybody, this is our lecture on the prison industrial complex and state prisons, lecture 15.1. So, yeah, what exactly is the prison industrial complex? It is defined by Davis as an interconnection between the social structures of the prison system, government, and business dedicated to convicting individuals of crimes and housing those individuals after conviction. This term was coined in the 1990s by social historian Mike Davis, and it's a useful idea. So when we're talking about the prison industrial complex, we are talking about an interconnection of social structures that makes the prison system what it is. We have to keep in mind that the prison industrial complex is a capitalist venture. Thus, its first objective is profit. It is run both by private companies that we typically think of as being capitalist and the state. The state isn't always or even typically capitalist, but in these situations regarding prisons, they are being run to profit the state, right? So it's like a business within the state that helps the state. And this thus discourages prison reform, inmate reform, or early release because all of those things take cuts out of the profit motive in prisons. The prison industrial complex benefits greatly from the war on drugs because when the war on drugs started in the 1980s, it dramatically increased the number of people in prison. And it also unfairly targets people of color. So part of the reason why we have skewed demographics in terms of black people and Latino people being in prison is because those populations, the way policing operates, are unfairly focused on in terms of cracking down on drugs. If you really want to read up more about this, read up on the difference between how we treat powder cocaine offenders versus crack cocaine offenders, and there's a very interesting academic discussion I can't really go into here because it would take too long. But white people tend to use powder cocaine, black people and poorer people tend to use crack cocaine when they do use cocaine, and that really the laws against crack cocaine versus powder cocaine are incredibly skewed. I'll just leave it at that. You want to learn more about that, read up on it. It's very interesting. So why are we calling it a prison industrial complex? Well, it is called that because President Eisenhower in 1961 introduced the nation to an idea of a military industrial complex. So Eisenhower observed that the interconnection between business and industry that encouraged profit from military ventures, right? And he identified this as being a bad thing. He did not think the military-industrial complex was a good thing. He put together this word to criticize the way the military was operating. Well, and he was saying that it needs to be broken down because a for-profit military, a military that works hand in hand with private business, Eisenhower felt was a very bad thing, which was a striking statement from Eisenhower because he was a conservative president. He was a military general. And the fact that he was criticizing the military in one of his very final speeches and one of his final public appearances really says a lot. And Davis points out that both complexes, the military-industrial complex and the prison-industrial complex, have the same goals and they feed off each other. She puts forth the example that both use similar crowd control technologies. The military may tend to use more lethal technologies, but they share, for example, producers in body armor. They share manufacturing techniques and companies, and also military supplies are frequently produced by prison labor. Additionally, Davis puts forth that both the prison system and the military system are define success by, quote, social destruction. You could see that as opinionated in Davis's own way. There are some very interesting arguments there to be had, but that's how she puts it forth. So she says that the military exists to destroy societies and prisons exist to destroy people. You certainly could have a detailed argument about that. It's a striking statement, though. So the prison-industrial complex argument is inextricably tied with the system is racist type arguments, right? So we see why we see it here in this book. The argument is made that the prison-industrial complex is a major force in terms of politics, production, and land development, right? So it has a lot to play in our economy and our political system. It contends that prisons were built because they are, quote, good for business, and they continue to be built as they're good for business. And a lot of the ways when a new prison is built and it's sold to the community, right, we say, well, this will bring in jobs. This will be good for the local economy. And there's a certain truth to that and what justifies the prison system as they exist. And prisons stay filled because of racist structures in our police systems. So that is tied in with the system is racist arguments, right? And it is a statistically verifiable fact that more black males, young black males, are more likely to go to prison than they are to go to college. That's a fact. Why that happens is complex. A lot of sociological research has shown recently that there are indeed racist trends in policing. Many of those are not fully understood yet, and there are reasons for that. But again, if you have questions about that, you want to read more about that, send me an email. I can give you some interesting readings in that regard. Davis's conclusion then is if prisons are indeed racist, as she contends, that those who profit would be unlikely to get rid of racism because they profit from it. And if you're thinking from a cold business sense, if you're a business person with no ethics, then that would make sense. She puts it in another way. There certainly were some slave masters who may have been nice people, but they would have not opposed slavery because they profited from it. So put another way, you don't necessarily have to be a cold prison official or prison guard or CEO of a prison company. You would be unlikely to challenge the system. You would be unlikely to even see the system as being racist because you are benefiting and being made rich by that system. Let's talk about what created the prison-industrial complex. Most of what sociologists do is study how social structures interact with each other. And the structures have interacted in recent history, as in the last 50 years, to create a dramatic growth in the prison-industrial complex. Now, sometimes when people see sociologists talking about stuff like this, they talk about, it's like, oh, it's just a giant conspiracy theory with you people. No, it's not a conspiracy. This is because there was no group of people saying, yeah, I know how we can make prisons terrible, right? It was just how the pieces of society came together. No overwhelming entity was saying, let's lock up all the black people, right? Or all the Latino people in disproportionate number to white people. They weren't saying that. But the way the structures that were already present in our society came together had that result. Here are some of the pieces that came together. Over the last 50 years, we've seen dramatic reductions in welfare programs and public mental health facilities. And this especially occurred during the Reagan era, so in the 1980s. And this has been widely acknowledged as having created a population increase in the prison system. So more people are desperate, thus more people are committing crimes to try to feed their family, that sort of thing. State governments are lacking funding, not directly related to those public welfare diminishments. But it is also true states need funding. Well, they use prisons in order to fund other programs, right? So that's another piece. Corporations, furthermore, are desiring profit. So this is where for-profit prisons come in. Thus, they build and open new prisons. They minimize safety and guard pay. They minimize food quality, and they maximize profits. And this makes prisons increasingly more terrible. We'll talk about that in our next lecture when we talk about private prisons. And another major piece was the war on drugs, which, again, also during the 1980s. We can stem a lot of the growth in the recent prison systems from policies of the 1980s. That the war on drugs disproportionately impacts and impacted racial minorities and created a population surge in black and Latino inmates that we don't see a corresponding surge in white inmates. So, who profits from the prison industrial complex? Well, prisoners are seen as a profit source to both state-run and private prisons. The government pays prisons to house inmates. So, either state governments or federal governments will pay individual prisons to basically keep inmates alive. And they are paid a given fee for each inmate. And they're paid the same fee whether they treat the inmates good or they treat the inmates bad. So the way this works between states is that states pay other states when they take out-of-state prisoners into theirs. So if a prisoner from Pennsylvania is shipped to Texas, then the state of Pennsylvania would pay the state of Texas in order to do that. So this can be a lucrative thing for states that are having budget issues to do. Private companies then also are doing this, but private companies, because they are less regulated, because they're more driven by capitalism, are doing it to keep prisons in there as long as possible, thus to maximize profit. And this keeps facilities filled, and this also contributes to overcrowding. Continued. Prisoners are used as low-cost laborers, and this can lead to... this means that prisoners are paid dramatically less than those not in prison. And they have almost no choice in the situation whether they are going to work or not. This, among other things, is one of the parts that Orange is the New Black, the series on women's prisons, really lays out very well. Orange is the New Black lays out a lot of the dynamics as far as guard abuse sexually of prison inmates. It also lays out exploitation of workers economically very well. In the past, mostly in the past anyway, not since World War II, but in the past, medical experimentation of prison inmates have also, it's occurred. And there's still some minor medical experimentation that occurs in the prison system, but it's not as dramatic as it was in the past. Page 89 of our Prisons Obsolete lays out what that looked like pretty well. So where are these prisoners? Let's explore that. So Texas has the largest prison population. If we look at this chart over here, we have 172,000 prison inmates, and it generates $80 million for the state annually. There are 34 prisons in the state of Texas, and those are both state prisons and private prisons. And that doesn't cover separate corporate prisons, too. So actually, that's a typo then. So it's 34 state prisons in Texas, and that doesn't include the corporate prisons. Those corporate prisons would be the private prisons. Louisiana, after Texas, has the largest prisoner to population ratio. So, Louisiana has the most people per population, which is notable. This isn't super notable on a national scale, but since it is New Mexico, it is notable that New Mexico is notable in terms of percent of inmate population in private facilities. So 44% of the inmates in New Mexico, are in private prisons, and that is a lot higher than other places. And this data is a bit dated. I think it's about 5 years old. And that is likely higher now. So we might be up to about 50%, maybe over 51%, in terms of the inmates in private facilities in New Mexico. So yeah, that's just some rough data as to where these prisons are. And this is the information we need going into our conversations for this week. That in the next presentation, of course. If you have any questions, as always, please let me know, and I look forward to talking to you in the discussion boards.